Joining us live now after a pretty wild election night.
Yeah, and Governor, before we get started on the specific issues, just your overall thoughts on what we saw.
So nationally, people are hurting. A lot of times when people are hurting in large numbers, they vote out the incumbent, and in this case, Kamala represented the incumbent. I think a lot of people are going to wrestle with what this means for America, and I do want to say I'm particularly concerned about women and the way they were described and discussed politically over the past, several months or years. But this is what happens sometimes, and the important thing to remember is in America, we are a democracy. We do transfer power peacefully, and you're seeing that across the country. Even though the transition won't come until January formally, I think it's important to recognize that we do things a lot better than many other countries, which would be in deep revolt right now in some of those nations. So that's one of the things. People are hurting. I am concerned about individuals that are suffering and struggling and have been described as other, targeted. We're going to have to be very supportive of people. A lot of people are waking up today. If they supported Kamala Harris and Tim Walton, they're feeling very sad and feeling desperate. We should be supportive of them, and then we should move America forward. We heal our country together.
Got to ask you, in talking about women's health rights in particular, that should not be affected here in Hawaii, right?
Correct. The first thing I did 2 years ago when I was sworn in was we quickly passed a bill to protect women's reproductive rights in Hawaii. They are totally protected, and their providers are protected, so that doctors and nurses can't be targeted if they provide contraception, or if a person has a miscarriage and needs an abortion or chooses to have an abortion. So women's reproductive rights are safe in Hawaii, and we're going to stick with our values in our state. We're going to care for people. We are going to meet their needs.
Yeah, there's going to be a shift on Capitol Hill. You collaborate a lot with lawmakers from other states, governors, members of Congress. How does this change what you want to do and the associations that you're going to have?
Well, from a political ideology standpoint, it doesn't change anything. We need housing and affordability. Interestingly, I was cutting taxes pretty aggressively, and that may very well be the flavor of the month with the new administration. But yeah, it hurts because our senators and reps may very well not have as good committee assignments and not have the same kind of influence, but they are terrific people. They will work across the aisle, I'm sure. I have a lot of relationships with Democrat and Republican governors, and that hasn't changed. So I'm going to go forward to make sure that we meet our needs, but it might be more difficult from a financial standpoint because what has historically happened, and remember, I was lieutenant governor under President Trump when he was president the first time. Sometimes there are talks about deep cuts to Medicaid. Some of our social safety net could be challenged. They talk about block grants a lot when they get into power. But I've navigated it before. I'll navigate it again.
We wanted to talk to you about Maui's recovery because you've talked specifically about how you have felt supported by this Biden administration. Should we be concerned going forward that we will not get the support from the federal government that we have seen in the past for Maui?
It's hard to say how they'll treat FEMA and HUD in the next administration. The truth is, a lot of states have been hit hard, red and blue. I would expect that a disaster relief package will be passed, very possibly even before President Trump is sworn in again. So I'm going to keep fighting for the dollars that we need. Our settlement is intact. It should probably be finalized in the next 4 to 6 weeks. The Supreme Court has to weigh in. We have the resources here to help, but there is about $1.2 billion on the table that would go to Maui for their recovery. And I sure hope that the work we did before, I met with the previous Speaker of the House. That was when Speaker McCarthy was still Speaker, and a lot of the Freedom Caucus, very conservative people, and they were supportive because they saw our needs and they saw our values. And so I expect that to hold, but it just might mean I have to fight a little harder.
Local results took a while to get in. Why are we still having problems locally?
A lot of people went and voted in person.
Yeah.
And, my recommendation to people is vote by mail. It's safe. I did that 2 weeks before, and my votes were counted, and it was simple, and that's the case for anyone who does that. But lots and lots of people went and decided to stand in line. And when thousands of people stand in line, as we're trying to encourage mail-in or early walk-in type of voting, they didn't take it. Not all of them took it. But, it doesn't really make any difference.
Right.
We either would have heard it at 7 or 8 p.m. or we heard in the middle of the night. The democracy was intact.
Yeah.
Wanted to ask you about the voters. Many of them who supported Mr. Trump said they voted for him because they thought he'd be best for the economy. Today, the Dow is rallying up almost 1,300 points. Do you think this will have a positive effect on our economy here in Hawaii?
Oh, well, some investors are going to do well, of course. Corporations will tend to do very well. Billionaires will do very well. He is not going to be inclined to raise wages for people who are working in kind of the middle part of the economy. The likelihood is there will be a lot more tax breaks for affluent people, and that usually comes at the cost of tax breaks for middle class people. Also, that will lead to significant inflation, and middle class people pay that. But people, like I said up front, they were hurting, and Mr. Trump, tapped into that. He tapped into that for a lot of people who would do better typically under a Democratic president. But when you're hurting, a lot of people don't distinguish that kind of thing. Again, the pendulum swings both ways. I've served in office when it was W, when it was Obama, when it was Trump and Biden, and you weather these storms. But you got to look out for people who are in deep trouble and have great need, and I hope that the parties can come together and do that.
Yeah, some of the local races at this point still too early to call, but anything stand out to you from what you saw here in Hawaii last night?
Yeah, the switch, congratulations to Kimo Alameda. He ran a very good campaign. Mitch Ross, a personal friend of mine. Kimo and I, interestingly, both worked at Bay Clinic. That's what brought me to Hawaii, to work with the Bay Clinic, which is the health center in Hilo and Ka'u. And so he's a good human being. He has roots way back to Billy Kenoi. And I feel for Mitch, but that was a big win for Kimo. I think that, again, Kimo's going to focus on housing and homelessness and things that we're focused on. So I don't think you're going to see much change in local government, local politics here. There were a couple incumbents that looked like they may have lost. A couple people held on just by kind of a small margin. But most of our races were already settled months ago.
Yeah.
Climate change has been such a big issue for us here in Hawaii. Do you think that we'll see less support with the Republican administration?
Yes, we will not see that as a focus from the Republican administration. They are going to, one of the big things that will happen is there'll be a lot more oil drilling in the United States and in our country. There will be a lot more use of whatever fossil fuel they can come up with. But interestingly, both parties had already pivoted towards alternatives to bridge to the future with LNG, with solar investment. There'll just be more oil investment under Mr. Trump, I would guess.
Yeah. One last message. This was so contentious over this past year. Your message to our viewers and just voters in general.
Well, in spite of the election result, and Hawaii was what it has always been, it's about 2/3 for the Democrat and 1/3 for the Republican. People will have to rally around those who are hurting today, so be supportive of people. But right and wrong doesn't change. Elections change, the party's leadership, you see different majorities and different minorities, but right and wrong still are intact. And so we got to treat people with respect and dignity and find a way with the policies. But the sun's still coming up. The sun came up on the East Coast with all my friends and family texting me, but maybe it hasn't come up here yet. It will come up in a few minutes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Governor. Appreciate your time.
Again, we are tracking all the results as they come in.